Back on the M715 project, working on the upgrades for the Cummins motor. The first thing we're dealing with is our injection pump. And there's a couple of minor upgrades that we want to do for this completely rebuilt pump before we put it into the vehicle. This is a pump that has been completely rebuilt by a local facility here in Denver, but they've rebuilt it to stock specs. What I want to do as part of my upgrades is to upgrade the fuel pin as well as to upgrade the governor spring, and I'm using the Hungry Diesel fuel pin for this. Provides a little bit more power, a little bit more fueling, a little bit more drivability. Now it's important as we take this apart to make sure that we've indexed the throttle linkage correctly so that everything functions as it should and as it was. For that, we want to make sure that we mark where things were at before we start and before we begin our disassembly so that we can put everything back into the same place. I also want to pay attention to the orientation of the spring, this little plastic retainer, and the throttle plate itself. First thing we're going to need to do is to remove our throttle linkage. Now this is unbolt the hex at the top. Now we want to mark what the orientation of the throttle shaft to the top portion of our throttle linkage was so that we can make sure this is reinstalled in the same location and the same orientation on the throttle shaft when we put it back together. Once you remove the upper linkage, you want to check the indexing and remove the washers. There is a small washer and also a larger washer that in this case was actually stuck to the bottom of my upper arm. These go back together in the same place. Now it's important to make sure that you have the indexing of this lower throttle plate to the throttle shaft correctly. There is a notch in the top of the throttle shaft and a set of marks in the throttle plate, but it's also useful to make a mark for yourself, again, to ensure that this is reinstalled in the same orientation. Once that's done and you've made note of the indexing, you can remove the throttle plate and separate it from the spring, return spring. Pay attention again to the orientation of the return spring and the little plastic tab sitting between the two nubs on the housing of the pump itself. Work this out, raise it up and off, and set it aside. Next, we're going to remove the 4 bolts that hold the top half of the pump housing onto the lower half of the pump. There's going to be 4 of these. It will require a little bit of creativity to get to the rear bolt. Just use a ball head Allen wrench and you'll do fine. This can be done on the vehicle, but it does require the ball-headed Allen key. Otherwise, you will not be able to get to that back bolt. Simply break them loose and remove the bolts. This back one can be a little fiddly as you try to get access to it and apply torque. Again, this is the right tool. Sometimes a little extra lever with a wrench can help you do what you need to do to break it loose. On this back bolt, it may not come all the way out because of the interference with the idle adjustment screw. However, it will come loose where it's no longer in the lower section of the pump, and so you can continue disassembly. Take the last bolt out to complete your disassembly of the pump. Now, taking a closer look at the interference with this last bolt and the idle screw. You can see where the one is just in the way of the other. Now at this point we can take the top off of the pump, just lift it straight up, wiggle a little bit, and it will come loose. Inside you will be able to see the governor spring connected to the throttle plate inside. You will need to disconnect that and be careful to not drop pieces as you do this. This is the governor spring, the piece that actually is the upgrade. Disconnect that from the retainer, but be careful not to let the retainer, which is also spring-loaded, disappear and take off. This retainer is spring-loaded as well and will take off without it. Now what you're looking at is the actual inner workings of the throttle in the pump. And there is this back lever that is engaged with the power screw. This will interfere with that as it comes back together because it rests on that when it's in this system. So we will need to make an adjustment as well as making sure that everything is clear so that we can put the pump back together. Now, first we're going to install our new 366 governor spring. This is the 3200 RPM governor replacement. Inside you can see the power screw that engages with that rear tab. This is why we need to back this out so that we can put the housing back together correctly. We want to mark our screw so that we can put it into the same place. Adjustment for this can cause a runaway in the vehicle, so we need to make sure it ends up in the right place. Okay, grab the retainer, make sure you understand where the hole is, put it back into the plate, being careful not to drop it into the pump. Now take your spring, hook it into the retainer, and then you'll need to reattach it to into the throttle shaft in the upper section of the housing. This may take a little bit of finesse to hold everything together, being careful again not to drop pieces into the innards of the pump. Once you manage to attach it to the throttle plate, you can then reassemble the top portion of the pump, being very careful to get things in the right place without hooking or hanging up on the levers inside the pump. Once it's oriented, go ahead and start the screws into place. You will want to tighten these evenly, so a little bit at a time to make sure that everything continues to seat correctly. You can check and make sure you can feel the spring as you turn and release the throttle shaft, and then you can go ahead and snug everything down and tighten it up for real. Again, we want to make sure that we tighten things evenly in a crisscross pattern across the pump. Now that the top of the pump has been reattached, you want to go ahead and bring the power screw back to the location that it was at before you backed it off. This is a matter of bringing it in, bring it to the right location, and you will probably need to hold it in place while you tighten the lock nut. Now we're going to begin to reassemble our throttle, which means we want to set our spring back between these two nubs. Make note that the plastic retainer must also fit in that space. Now that you've got the spring oriented with the retainer in place, we want to bring the upper half of the linkage. It will need to engage on the tab on that paddle. You also need to make sure that it is indexed to the throttle shaft correctly. In my case, bringing this in and locking the serrations in place required a little bit of an adjustment with the idle screw. So breaking the lock nut back so that I can release the idle screw to give me a little more flexibility in the placement of my throttle arm to index it correctly to the throttle shaft. With the idle screw backed off, I can bring my throttle arm into place, check the indexing. I was a little bit off, so I release it, adjust, and bring it back in to lock it down. Next up is to reinstall the small washer, followed by the large washer, and then to reinstall the upper throttle plate, making sure to index the spring over the top of the little nub. Once that's done, we can return our idle screw to its original location, hold it in place, and lock down the lock nut as well. Verify that the throttle linkage works as expected, and that concludes the upgrade of the governor spring. Second item we're going to do is the upgrade of the fuel pin. This is installed in the upper section of the pump. It requires the removal of the 4 bolts and the 1 standard screw at the top. Break these loose and remove them in a cross manner. Be aware, however, that there is a spring inside here, and so you will want to do this evenly and in a controlled manner. Lift this up. You'll find the original fuel pin attached to the diaphragm from which you need to remove it. This is attached simply with a nut on the top, and there are a couple of flats on the bottom which will engage with a wrench as well. Taking a wrench on either side, you can remove the fuel pin from the diaphragm and then install the new fuel pin onto the diaphragm in the same way. Now we want to install the fuel pin back into the pump, making sure that the bevel is towards the front of the pump, pointing towards the radiator, the fan, and the gear case. Seat the diaphragm into the top of the pump, ensuring that it is resting in its little groove correctly. Once that's done, we can install the top of the housing back together, along with the 4 bolts that attach it in its original orientation. Tighten these down evenly in a cross manner, and that will conclude the upgrade of the fuel pin for your new pump. This is now ready to be installed into the vehicle. If you had done this in the vehicle, it needs to be reconnected to everything that was removed. If you like what we do us a favor, like, subscribe, comment, and share.